Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. The month of March is over. I think most of us would agree that March 2021 was hot garbage. I mean, March 2020 was rough. This felt like a repeat, and it felt incredibly long, but the upside was that I escaped into a lot of really good stories in other worlds besides ours. Really interesting things were going on. So I have some books to share with you, and then I also watched some really good like movies and YouTube videos and stuff this month, so we'll do a little bit of a March wrap up. I will say also that in the month of March, a lot of changes began. They have not like fully taken place yet, but April is gonna be a month of change. So you will be seeing some changes around here. I think maybe in my next video, I can give you a little bit more of an update. We'll also be going back like kind of in person in the middle of April. It's just like the kids who want to come back will, and then the kids who don't will stay at home. And the numbers of kids who did want to come back in person were low enough that we don't have to do any kind of like a cohort thing. Like they can just come to all of their classes, and I think the most I have in any class is 11. So I'll be teaching those 11 kids in my classroom while the other 20 something are at home. So we're still gonna like do it through Zoom, but you know, it'll be nice to just like be on campus and have people with legs around. So anyway, more on that coming up soon. This month I have 7 books to review for you, and it was a pretty good month of reading overall. None of these were like a dud. I started the month with the Radium Girls, and this is the Young Readers Edition by Kate Moore. I mentioned this one in a YouTube video, I think like a couple months ago, and so many people were like, I loved that book, or my students really loved the Young Readers Edition, and it is really, really interesting. So this is historical nonfiction, right? So it's just telling you the story of something that happened in real life. So this book is about a group of women at 2 different factories. One was in New Jersey and one was in Illinois in like the 1920s, I believe. It might start in like the 19-teens. Oh yeah, it must have, because when it starts, they are making like dials and instruments for planes during World War I. And so they're using radium to make the numbers and the symbols on these instruments glow in the dark. And so in order to do that and to like get them very precise, because they also end up making like watch faces and stuff. So you know, those little numbers and like Roman numerals and stuff are really tiny. So they have to take a paintbrush and like put it in their mouth so that you get that like really fine tip, and then dip it in the radium, you know, paint a couple numbers, and then like do it again to get the tip really fine. So this whole time these girls are just ingesting radium, and at that time they thought that it was actually like really good for you. They would sell like health supplements and stuff with radium in them, and then the girls themselves, like after work, they would kind of glow, like they would have like the powder from the radium all over them, and they would like go out to the clubs and stuff at night, and it was kind of like a status marker that you glowed because you were one of the Radium Girls who had one of these really good jobs. And it does go into like the 1920s, so you know, this is an era of like women beginning to have dreams of, you know, not just working, because women have always worked, but like being a professional and like having a skill and getting paid for that skill, and maybe even like being independent and not having to like get married or rely on your parents forever. So you get a sense of kind of like, you know, the social shifts at this time. But the story is about how these girls, of course, get sick from the radium, and it just sounds absolutely miserable. I mean, I guess what happens is that like your body mistakes something in the radium for calcium, and it just like pulls it into your bones. So then your bones like start to replace themselves with like radium, and they just, like, your bones just like disintegrate So these women start having all kinds of like teeth and jaw problems at first, and then, you know, they're like having problems with all of their limbs, and it's just awful. Like, it sounds like such a painful, horrible, just terrible thing to go through. And of course these companies say that it has nothing to do with them, that this is not their fault, and that, you know, they change their story, like, oh, well, we never told them to put it in their mouths, all this kind of stuff. So these women who are like literally crumbling before our very eyes are trying to fight against these huge companies, and their medical bills are just skyrocketing. Their health is terrible, but they do, like, I'm just like, wow, how do they even function at all? But quite a few of them like get married and have children, and a lot of the husbands like fight really, really hard for their wives and try to get them healthy, and also try to fight against these companies to just try to get some kind of help for the medical bills so that they're not ruined entirely. And it's just really fascinating. The whole time you're just like, oh my God. But the gaslighting in here is it's just infuriating, and is just, you know, a very common tale of how we treat workers, and how companies just like will not budge an inch to make sure that workers are taken care of, even in the slightest, because then they might have to also take care of other workers. It's so horrible. But yeah, it is really interesting, and I think for like middle school students, this would be cool in like a literature circle thing with, you know, maybe like nonfiction. I think you could find a few other nonfiction books like this and do something pretty cool with it. And I've heard some science teachers say that they used it too. So yeah, this one was really good. So season 5 of Insecure is coming up. I forget when the like premiere date is, but it's coming sometime soon, and then this is going to be the last season ever. And I really love Insecure and the characters, and just like the storyline is just different from most things that are on TV. So I read The Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl by Issa Rae. It's a pretty short little memoir. This was written like before she really got into Insecure. If she ever writes another memoir with more like behind the scenes information about Insecure, I would definitely get that. This one is more about her growing up and then like starting her YouTube channel, which is called The Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl. And as somebody who is like, you know, a very long time viewer of YouTube, and I've had my channel for a long time, it's really interesting to me to see the people who like got in on this really early, like who just kind of like understood how powerful this platform could be for the type of stories that they want to tell. I think that's one of the coolest things about YouTube, is the people who got really successful off of it, or a lot of them anyway, are people who Hollywood just probably wouldn't have been the avenue where they could be really successful. I'm thinking of like Colleen, who I went to college with. We were in women's choir together, and like her whole thing was really weird, right? Like Miranda sings, and so that was maybe not something that she could pitch to like an actual production company, but millions of people all over the world watch her videos. And then like Issa Rae, like Liza, and just all of these people who are different from like the leading ladies or the leading men of Hollywood. Like either they're people of color, or they're openly gay, or whatever. Like they have their own much more interesting stories to tell, I think, and they kind of like forge their own path through YouTube. And I just think the stories that they have to tell are so much more interesting, and they've made the entertainment industry so much better. So that's what I liked about this book. It's also just like really fun to read about her life and growing up and everything. And I'm excited for season 5 of Insecure. Oh my goodness, this next one. This is one of the most unique books that I have read ever. This is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank by Nathan Englander, and it is not what I expected. I thought this was going to be like nonfiction, like actually talking about Anne Frank. It isn't. This is a book of short stories by a masterful writer, like one of those writers I just like can't even wrap my mind around how they do what they do. Kind of reminds me of like Hari Kunzru. This book itself kind of reminds me of The Office of Historical Collections by Danielle Evans. I would put these two in like a very similar category because it's a collection of short stories written by the same author, and there is a theme that like runs throughout. So in Office of Historical Corrections, did I say collections last time? Corrections. Office of Historical Corrections. Black identity and history runs through most of the stories in that book. And then in this one, Jewish identity and history runs through all of the stories, I think. So one story is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. And it's so weird. The characters are so odd. It's a lot of like dialogue with whole like rivers of meaning underneath what they're actually saying. And just to give you like a little bit of insight into it, I feel like this is gonna make it seem too tidy. None of these stories are very tidy, but just so that you know what the title is talking about, this short story is a group of these two couples. One couple is like Hasidic, Orthodox Jewish. They moved to Israel and then they're in Florida visiting the other couple. And one of the wives plays like a game, like the Anne Frank game, where they talk about like, if the Holocaust were to happen again, who do you think would hide us and save us and bring us food? So they go through like their list of friends and try to think of who wouldn't turn them in. Some of their friends are like, yeah, like this guy would, but like his wife would sell us out while he was at work, and like, oh yeah, maybe this couple. And so it's like a really dark conversation. The whole book is like very dark, but very funny and very sharp and very just like quick-witted and so interesting. I mean, just again, like one of the most masterful collections of short stories I've ever read. It really makes you think. The stories will stick with you. This is not for children, so when you do the Diary of Anne Frank, this is not something you're going to be able to tie into your curriculum, but as an adult, this is really, really interesting. By the way, I love how my rainbow stack turned out. I have some new books up here, so I can't wait to read everything in that stack and then do like a rainbow book review. This month, I think everyone read Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. How many of you out there read this book this month? It was a Reese's book club pick, then Amory's book club pick, and it's very, very good. And I think this one would actually be great for a high school class. If you teach, I don't know, maybe like juniors or seniors, I think this would be perfect. It's very well paced. It brings together the threads of this family, some of whom are in the United States, 2 or 3 of them are in Colombia, and they have like mixed citizenship status within their family, and so they are just trying to do what they can to survive, to stay safe, to make money. And it's just a very, very interesting look at kind of the lack of choices that people have, or the lack of good choices. There's a lot of juxtaposition between the violence in Colombia, particularly like the gun violence, and then the violence in the United States. We have a lot of gun violence here. You really get into all the legal issues surrounding immigration and the different things that can happen. It's stuff that you probably know, but it's very well done in this story. And so then I was watching the Instagram live between Patricia Engel and Amory, and it's still on Amory's Instagram videos. Like you could go back and watch it. And one thing that Patricia Engel was saying is that like in the United States, we have a little bit of a harder time understanding this because the United States is enormous. It's so huge, and we are able to travel throughout the United States without really having to show documentation, you know, to go between states. So if you live in California and the prices are too high here, or, you know, there are not enough jobs here, you can move 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away to a different state and start over. And you're not going to be prevented from going back to visit the family that you still have in the first place. You're not going to be prevented from certain jobs, you know, in this other state, and people are probably going to speak your language. And she just gave the example of like Amory was born in Massachusetts. So she was like, what if you were not ever allowed to leave Massachusetts because that's where you were born, that's where your citizenship was, and you know, then there weren't any jobs there, and you wanted to travel to like Vermont, for example, to get a job and try to provide for your family, but you weren't able to get the paperwork to do so. So this is just something that Americans who haven't, you know, ever traveled really or worked in different countries or tried to get citizenship in a different country, like something that we don't really understand all that well because of how freely like we travel about this country and because of just like how many different options we have here, and not everybody has all of those options. So really, really good. On my Instagram, I also listed a couple of my favorite quotes from this book. So if you search the hashtag Too Cool for Middle School Books, that's how I'm like organizing all of my book reviews so that they're a little bit easier to find, like within my thousands of Instagram posts. So you can find this one and all of them there. The next book that I read, another favorite, this is The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America by Gerald Horne. A few people on Instagram said that they went to, where does he teach? University of Houston, and like studied under him or like, you know, took his classes. I was like, oh my goodness. I don't understand how he's written 30 books, over 30 books, and they're so well done. Like, okay, this book is, I always put a little fold so that I know how far I actually have to read. Like, you know, this part is just the notes. So 252 pages. I read this in 24 hours. It was that compelling. I mean, I like historical monographs anyway, but this is so well written. I was just like, gosh, how do you do this? So this book is about slavery during the colonial period. And I really think that all US history teachers need to read this book because this answers all of those questions that students ask. So like, US history is always fuzzy in some places. I don't currently teach it, but I did for 4 or 5 years. And like, we would always come to certain sections, things that I was trying to explain, and I knew they were gonna ask questions. And I just like never had a good answer. And this has all of those answers. Like, why didn't enslaved people just run away or like kill their masters? They did all the freaking time, particularly during the colonial period. So this is the other thing too. I've complained about this in other videos, but we tend not to bring slavery up at all in US history classes until like right before the Civil War. Like, oh yeah, and this was happening, and then this caused a split between the North and the South. But so much of US history is shaped by, informed by the practice of slavery, which dates back to, in the United States, 1619, and then even earlier in the Caribbean and South America and Mexico and Florida, etc. But most of the time, the enslaved people would be taken from Africa to the Caribbean, and they constantly ran away there and like organized and had uprisings and everything. And a very small percentage of them actually were taken to the United States, and they were kind of like radicalized already at that point. They knew like poisons and different ways to kill their masters and make them sick. Like, part of the reason that the slave traders and owners in the United States were like so brutal and so evil is because it was a response to like, yes, these people revolted and rebelled and tried to run away and tried to kill their masters all the time. And so much of the laws and what happened in like pre-Revolutionary War America was to try to tighten this stranglehold on the practice of slavery, because it was very difficult. Like, I think that's one thing that we kind of don't convey very well through US history, is like, it is difficult to own other people because that's really unnatural. It's very hard to do. They do not want to be owned. They are not going to go into this willingly and without resistance. And in a lot of the other European countries, like England, for example, they were all fighting so many wars like all over the globe, England was using a lot of black people as soldiers and like arming them, and they just needed soldiers, man. So the colonists in North America are not happy with this. They don't like seeing that. Like when the redcoats came into the colonies, to stop them from like throwing tea overboard and to enforce all these tax laws and stuff, there were black redcoats. And these colonists who are trying to establish this new economy on their own, and they think that they need to do this through slavery, are pushing back against England. And this is where a lot of the discontentment with England comes from, and this is a huge reason why the colonists band together to fight the Revolutionary War. It wasn't just about some stamps and some tea. It was also about being able to own slaves. England was kind of moving towards abolition at this point. And we're always like, well, it was a different time. Like, people just saw things differently. But there are a bunch of quotes in here from British people who are like making fun of the colonists, the patriots, and they're like, the loudest cries for liberty come from these people who literally enslave other people. They thought that was very hypocritical, as we do now. Like your 8th graders or whatever age of kids you have that you teach US history to, they're like, wait a minute. These people are shouting like, no taxation without representation. We want freedom. We want liberty. And at the same time, they are enslaving other humans. And I feel like our teachers always told us like, well, it was a different time. No, people were commenting upon that at that exact time as well. The other good thing that this book does is show like the formation of the white identity as a response to slavery, basically. Because British, Irish, Scottish, French, Spanish people who came to the Americas did not see each other as the same. They were literally murdering each other on the other side of the Atlantic. And so it was only in response to the practice of slavery that they even began to see each other as the same, or as white. So this is just like such an important and like foundational history book. Like, it sort of seems like, like once you've already learned US history, then you like throw in this fun little like side detail. But no, this is just like, this is what actually happened. So I can't recommend this highly enough, and I just want to read all of Gerald Horne's books. I fully have an academic crush on him now. I want to be able to write like that and study like that. It's just so dang good. The next book that I read was Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. This had been sitting on my desk for a long time. Not as long as I thought though, because this was only published in 2017. Did you realize that? I feel like I have known about this book for longer than that, but I guess I have not. I think when I first found out about it, I just assumed that it had been published a long time ago, because it is an instant classic. Like, this is something that is going to stand the test of time and be something that people read for decades and decades to come. So particularly after the shootings in Atlanta that disproportionately affected Korean women, I just felt like this was the right time for me to step into this world and just learn more about the history of, this is like the history of Korea and Japan beginning in like the 1930s, and then this is, a multi-generational story that takes you up through maybe like the 70s a little bit, but it's mostly set in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I have a lot of Korean American friends, and they were just hurting at this time, and I just wanted to be there for them and not burden them at all, and just learn a little bit more about the history of Korea. And this really isn't about like Korean families that immigrate to the United States. One character like goes to college in the States, but not everyone's trying to come to the States. But this still does just like provide a lot of context. And so it's about the Japanese occupation of Korea. And then in this book, some of the characters just have to move to Japan because Korea is so just like ruined. Like there's just no money, there's no jobs, there's nothing to do. But then they get to Japan and realize that they are incredibly discriminated against. There are very few jobs that they're able to have. There are very few places that they're able to live. They're just treated horribly just because they're Korean, and they're trying to do whatever it takes to feed their families. And then kind of similar to like Infinite Country, it just becomes this place where they are stuck because they cannot become Japanese citizens, but they also like, if you go back to Korea, then you can like never, like you don't have the right paperwork then to travel back to Japan ever, or I think to even like go to any other country. And then like North Korea is like completely falling apart, and they're not able to go there. And then like I think they would kind of just like end up with no citizenship. And so it's just this really awful, violent, terrible situation that, you know, wasn't that long ago, and that people are still carrying in their family histories. And not to like compare, but just to give us something to like wrap our minds around it a little bit, like kind of similar to Jewish people who are still carrying the weight of that history in their families as well. But I think people are a lot less sympathetic to Korean people because they don't know this history, and it's not something that we widely understand or know. So anyway, I just thought that this book was a really powerful way to just show this multi-generational trauma and survival. Also, most of the beginning was really interesting to me too, because one of the main characters is a minister, like a Christian minister. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but Koreans make up a huge part of the global church. And when we think of church history and theology, we should of course be including Korean Christians like in the picture that comes into our minds. And I don't think that we usually do. So one character in this book who like dies before it really starts, but it was like the Korean Christians who stood up and like fought against the communists in the north, I think. And then like in Japan, people were forced to like, I don't know, like bow before like a Shinto shrine or something like that. And Christians would get in trouble for if they refused to bow, you know. So like the legacy of Korean Christians is so powerful and so big. And so you get a little glimpse of that in this book as well. So this one is like 500 pages. It's amazing. Get it, read it, know it, love it. The 7th book that I read this month was on audio, and that one was The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. So this book is always going to remind me of getting my COVID vaccination because I was really tired after I got that second shot, and so I just laid down. I had slept a lot already, so I didn't really want to sleep, but I just wanted to like lay down and close my eyes. And so I listened to the audiobook for a couple of days. I got through quite a bit of it just during like that whole vaccine period. So audiobooks are really great for that. Like when you're not feeling well, this is a perfect thing to do. This is my first audiobook of 2021. I've read 23 books altogether, and one of them was an audiobook. So I don't listen to them super often, but actually I think in April, because I'm gonna be quite busy, I will probably listen to a few more audiobooks. Sometimes I like forget about them and I just have to like get back into it. So anyway, The Four Winds, I would say that it kind of has like 4 sections. So it starts in a small town in Texas right after World War I, and things are going pretty well. People are fairly prosperous. There's this girl, she's a daughter of like fairly wealthy parents. She has some sisters, she's like the reject. Some stuff happens with her and this guy. The beginning was not very interesting to me. So if it's not very interesting to you, stick with it. Fast forward a couple of years, and the main character, Elsa, she's living on a farm in Texas with her in-laws and her husband and her children. And there's a drought, there has been no rain, there is no topsoil, there are dust storms. They cannot survive here. So eventually she takes her children to California because everyone has been saying that's where all the work is. Go work, you know, on a farm in California. So then this next part of the book is like Grapes of Wrath. And I was a little bit like, okay, I mean, we already have Grapes of Wrath, like do something a little bit different now with this story here. And she does. So, and Kristen Hanna, like her thing is to kind of take these historical events that we kind of know, like, you know, we feel like we know the stories, and then to place women directly in the center of these stories and make sure that people see what this time was like from the perspective of women. She always has these like contentious relationships between daughters and mothers and sisters and all of that. So it's just like sad, 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 sad. Everything is going terribly. People treated Okies horribly. Then it gets a little bit more interesting. I thought anyway, like this is where she kind of like added her own spin on it. So then there were people who were organizers, communist organizers, who, you know, were trying to get the workers to strike and to defend themselves against these like predatory landowners, because they were running this system where like you could live on the land and then like buy your food and supplies and stuff on credit from like the company store, but then you couldn't pay that back in cash. You could only pay it back by working in the fields, and you didn't get paid with cash. You got paid with like little coupon type things, and then you had to cash those in at the company store, which there was a fee for. And so you were just in debt to these people forever. You were not able to get out. Like you continued to owe labor to these people. So just a really awful situation, and an interesting though like spin on this time in history that I hadn't really heard about before. So I just thought most of the beginning was like, yes, 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 we know. And then it does turn into something that gives you like a new outlook and perspective on this time in history. The other thing that I thought was interesting is how she did emphasize, like when they were in Texas, how, and she doesn't like explicitly say all this, but you know, the whole Great Plains, the United States purchased, sent in government agents like the Texas Rangers, for example, to commit genocide against all of the Indian tribes who were there, or shove them over to these reservations. And then all of these farmers from the East came through the Homestead Act and grew things on this land that they did not understand, ruined the topsoil, ruined millions of acres of land, and it didn't cause the Great Depression, but it coincided with the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And now we have an ecological crisis, an environmental crisis, an agricultural crisis, a food crisis, a labor crisis on top of this economic crisis. And a lot of it was man-made. Not that that makes it any less awful for the people who had to live through it, but understanding that and looking back at that should be a good warning to us that even when we face things that are out of our control, like a global pandemic, we can make conditions infinitely worse for ourselves. We can like actively ruin everyone's lives, or we can learn from the past and try to apply those lessons to today and try to avoid the awful conditions of times like the Great Depression. So I think she did a pretty good job of like subtly pushing through that message. I hope people get it. So those were all the books for March. We're just gonna stick to entertainment this month. That's all that I've been doing really, is entertaining myself. So TV show that I loved, Mrs. America. It's on Hulu, I think. We always need to know this now, like, okay, what platform? Do I have that platform? It is on Hulu. The really cool thing about this show is that 2 summers ago, I got to be in a JCPenney commercial, and I went out to New York and got to be in this commercial, and Vera from The Tutu Teacher was like in it with me. Well, we were there together, but she was kind of like doing her own version, and then I was doing a version. And Miriam Shore was the professional that I got to work with. I'm not a professional. She was just infinitely more talented than me. She was super funny. She's in Younger as well, and she's like a Broadway star. But I remember her telling me about this show that she was in the middle of working on. She's kind of like a minor character in Mrs. America, but she told me like the premise of it and everything, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So this is about the attempt at passing the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. So the characters in this miniseries are Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, Phyllis Schlafly, Bella Abzug, all of these like iconic feminists that like I've definitely read about and studied about and everything, but I got way more insight on them through this show. And it was just so interesting to see all of the conversations at that time. Shirley Chisholm. It's also kind of depressing to see like how much momentum they had during the 70s and how we've lost a lot of it. And stuff that seems like radical today, like, was actually like pretty close to being passed by like everybody in the 70s. So this is a show that I kind of just want to go right back to the beginning and watch it again. I wish that they would just continue it. I wish they would just like go all the way up until today with this same like plot line. It's so good. And it does just kind of make you mourn for the ERA. Like, come on, man. I remember learning about this in college. This was one of my favorite classes. I just took like women's history of the United States, and it was amazing. I loved that class. And I learned about a lot of this stuff, but yeah, you know, well, this is, you know, it's very visual. You get to see like the clothing and the hairstyles and like the dialogue, and it's of course scripted, so, you know, not everything occurred exactly as it was there, but it really just like helps to see things laid out in that way. And then to see like the shift with like the Reagan era and like the moral majority, and yeah, so watch it. It's so good. Movie recommendation is called Swing Kids. So we have been watching the movie Swing Kids with like Christian Bale from like the 90s, you know, in my class. I kind of mix that in with our Anne Frank unit. But when you look it up on Amazon Prime, another movie called Swing Kids comes up, and this one is a Korean film, and the plot is not the same. This one is set during the Korean War at a POW camp that is split down the middle, like communist and anti-communist. So the United States, you know, had captured these prisoners of war, but then if you can get them to like denounce communism, then they would get to come over to this other side and like have kind of different conditions. So I've seen quite a few Korean movies at this point. Maybe not quite a few, but like the ones that I have seen just like floored me. Like Train to Busan, if you have never seen that movie. I don't really like zombie movies, but this one is just like so different and well done. And then obviously Parasite. And I'm saving Minari for a big project I'm working on. That's like my reward that I get to watch when I get some work done. But this one, Swing Kids, is so good. It's so funny. It's so just like well shot. Like the pacing of it is excellent. There is swing dancing in it, which is amazing. It's actually not really swing dancing. It's tap dancing. So yeah, they do their tap dancing. The Chinese guy is my favorite. The story is amazing. The acting is amazing. The plot, like, just watch this movie. It's long. I want to say it was like almost 3 hours. Took me a while to get through, but it's fantastic. Okay, and then lastly, I have a YouTube series to recommend to you. There's a YouTuber called Jaime French, and she has like a beauty channel, you know, she does like makeup tutorials and stuff, and then she started doing these things called Movie and Makeup Mondays, and she like reviews kind of like obscure 90s movies and like 2000s movies. So she did Honey, which was one of my like favorite movies to hate watch with my best friend in high school. It's the one with Jessica Alba where she's like a dance teacher like slash choreographer, and oh my goodness, this review of this movie is the funniest thing that I've seen all month. My favorite thing that I saw all month. It was hilarious. My most vivid memory of Honey though is that there were all these previews for it, and like at one point she goes, "This is what I do." And me and my best friend Rochelle would say that all the time. "This is what I do." But then we went to see the movie and that line got cut from the movie, and we were like, we really wanted to know the context of that one line. But anyway, my camera battery is about to die. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I have some news coming up soon that I will share with you in the next couple of videos, so I will see you then. All right, bye.